Hey everyone, tonight we are stepping into a war that never fully ended, a war fought in shadows, whispered through desert winds, and carried on the backs of ordinary people who became pawns in a game between giants. It wasn't just tanks and soldiers that marched into Afghanistan in 1979, it was secrets, betrayals, and the long arms of two rival empires. The KGB and the CIA weren't facing each other directly. Instead, they pulled strings, armed allies, and turned a nation into the ultimate chessboard of the Cold War. Before we get into it, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, only if you truly love these deep dives into hidden history. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is. I love seeing how these stories echo across the globe, from late-night listeners to early morning explorers. Now, settle in. Let the noise of the day fade out. Tonight, we're traveling back to 1979, to the mountains of Afghanistan, where the war the world thought was distant suddenly became the center of everything. It begins not with the roar of tanks or the thunder of warplanes, but with a whisper carried in the narrow alleys of Kabul in the late 1970s, where merchants lower their voices as soldiers march past, and in the mud-walled villages of the countryside, where elders sit under ancient trees speaking in riddles because plain words have become dangerous. The whisper says that Afghanistan is not only a land of tribes and mountains, of kings and mullahs. It is about to become something far darker, a battlefield chosen by powers far away, where men in gray suits and hidden offices will fight their invisible war through the blood of Afghans. That whisper becomes a rumor, the rumor of fear, and the fear a certainty. Spies are already here. In the months before the Soviet tanks crossed the AMU Darya, before the CIA discovers its longest and most expensive covert program, Afghanistan is already smoldering. It is a country balanced precariously between past and future, between tradition and revolution. Its kings and presidents have fallen one by one, and each fall has echoed louder than the last. In palaces draped with Soviet velvet, ministers plot in Russian while their people pray in Pashto. And on the cracked roads of the countryside, Soviet advisors ride in black Volgas, watching a land they barely understand. Some know, even then, that they are riding toward a graveyard. The story of this war cannot be told without its prelude. The years when Afghanistan's fate was still malleable, when alliances were being cut in secret, when the KGB saw opportunity, and the CIA, watching from afar, wondered whether this remote, landlocked nation mattered at all. It begins with the illusion of stability, the kind that only masks decay. For centuries, Afghanistan had been called the graveyard of empires, but in the 20th century, it was treated as a prize in the Cold War chess match. Its king, Mohammad Zahir Shah, ruled for decades with cautious neutrality, balancing Soviet aid against Western promises. Kabul in the 1960s was a strange oasis. Young women in skirts studied at Kabul University, poets debated Marxism in tea houses, and foreign tourists trekked the hippie trail through its bazaars. Yet, beneath the surface, tribal traditions still held sway, resentment simmered in the rural provinces, and whispers of communism and Islamism began to harden into movements. The Soviets had been watching carefully. To Moscow, Afghanistan was both a buffer and an opportunity. Soviet engineers built roads and schools, Soviet military advisors trained Afghan officers, and the KGB quietly cultivated relationships with Afghan communists who dreamed of revolution. They came in the language of solidarity and progress, but behind the slogans was the unblinking eye of intelligence. Every Afghan student invited to Moscow, every officer trained at Frunze Academy, every minister given a Soviet friendship stipend was a potential asset, a pawn in a future conflict. By the mid-1970s, the cracks were wide enough for anyone to see. In 1973, Zahir Shah was overthrown by his cousin, Mohammad Daoud Khan, who declared a republic. Daoud had once been close to the Soviets, but as president he began to lean toward independence, flirting with the West, even warming to Washington. The KGB took note, and it did not forgive. Within Afghanistan itself, Marxist factions inside the army and government, secretly courted by Moscow for years, grew restless. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, a communist party split between rival factions, Khalq and Parsham, waited for its chance. Then, in April 1978, chance came wrapped in blood. When Daoud ordered the arrest of PDPA leaders, communist military officers launched what would be called the Sour Revolution. Tanks rolled into Kabul, the palace was stormed, and Daoud and his family were slaughtered in a hail of bullets. The communists seized power, installing Nur Muhammad Taraki, a Marxist ideologue, as president. For the Soviets, it seemed like a gift, their allies in charge of a strategically crucial country. For Afghans, it was the beginning of terror. Taraki and his fellow communists, including his ruthless deputy Hafizullah Amin, tried to force Marxism on a deeply traditional and religious society. They abolished bride prices, redistributed land, declared literacy campaigns, and unleashed their secret police to crush opposition. Anyone who resisted, landlords, mullahs, tribal elders, was branded a reactionary and executed. Mass arrests filled Kabul's jails with the groans of the tortured. The countryside erupted. Rebellion flared not only against the government, but against the very idea of foreign ideology being forced upon Afghan soil. The KGB was at Taraki's side from the first weeks, its advisors whispering instructions, helping structure Afghanistan's new secret police, KGB. They urged him to be firm, to consolidate power, to silence the mosques. But even within the Kremlin, doubts grew. Taraki was erratic, Amin was ambitious, and the Afghan communists were tearing each other apart as much as they were fighting the insurgency. The whispers in Moscow's corridors grew louder. Have we created an ally or a liability? Meanwhile, in Langley, the CIA was only beginning to pay attention. Afghanistan had always been low on Washington's list of priorities, a remote, landlocked country with little obvious strategic value compared to the oil-rich Middle East or the divided heart of Europe. But as reports of rebellion trickled out, as rumors of Soviet overreach mounted, CIA analysts began to see a familiar pattern. The Kremlin had long played the long game, turning small countries into buffers and clients. Afghanistan might not be oil, but it was a dagger pointing at both Iran and Pakistan. If the Soviets secured it, the balance of the region could tip dangerously. Inside Afghanistan, the fire spread faster than either superpower anticipated. Insurgents ambushed convoys, villages declared loyalty to Islam against communism, and entire provinces slipped from government control. The countryside belonged to the rebels by night, and often by day. Afghan soldiers deserted in droves. Amin's secret police hunted rebels, but the harder they struck, the more resistance grew. It was not long before the first betrayals surfaced. Afghan officers, trained by the Soviets, quietly funneled information to insurgents. Some Mujahideen commanders, outwardly loyal to the jihad, sold secrets to government agents to buy time. Double games became the currency of survival, and through it all, the KGB watched with cold eyes, compiling files, seeking which men could be turned, which tribes could be bought, which leaders could be eliminated. For ordinary Afghans, the shift was felt in whispers and glances. A neighbor disappeared in the night, never to return. A village elder was accused of harboring rebels and executed in front of his people. Students at Kabul University, once debating poetry, now vanished into interrogation chambers. Fear became as common as dust, and yet, in the bazaars, life went on. Carpets were sold, bread was baked, and merchants exchanged rumors that America was watching, that Pakistan was plotting, that God would punish the communists. The CIA, for its part, was still hesitant. Washington had recently endured humiliation in Vietnam, and President Jimmy Carter was cautious about overcommitting. But intelligence officers on the ground began to see opportunity. Afghanistan might be the place where America could finally make the Soviets bleed, not with American soldiers, not with open confrontation, but with shadows, by supporting those already rising against the Marxist regime. The seeds of Operation Cyclone were being planted, even before the first Soviet soldier set foot across the border. By late 1979, the situation had spiraled out of Kabul's control. Taraki was overthrown and killed by his deputy, Amin, in a brutal power struggle. Amin proved even more ruthless, executing rivals and tightening his grip, but his recklessness alarmed Moscow. Soviet leaders no longer trusted him. Some even suspected him of being an American agent. Paranoia gnawed at the Kremlin's Politburo. Could it be that the CIA had already infiltrated the very top of the Afghan government? The truth was murky, but in spy wars, suspicion is as lethal as proof. The KGB began plotting. Reports filtered into Moscow of massacres in the countryside, of Afghan army collapse, of Amin's enemies gaining strength. Soviet advisors in Kabul sent frantic cables. The Afghan communists could not survive without direct Soviet intervention. But in those same corridors of power, other voices warned, Afghanistan is a trap. The British had bled here in the 19th century, their empire humbled in these same mountains. Do not repeat their mistake. Yet the momentum was shifting. In September 1979, Taraki was dead, strangled on Amin's orders. Amin now stood alone, both feared and distrusted. Soviet intelligence intercepted reports of Amin reaching out to Washington, seeking new allies. Whether true or fabricated, it was enough. In the minds of the Kremlin, the possibility of an American foothold in Kabul was intolerable. And so, the decision was made. The soldiers were prepared, the plans drawn. Special forces units rehearsed storming palaces in the dark. Tanks massed at the border, camouflaged as exercises. KGB assassins studied Amin's routines, waiting for the order. The empire was about to gamble to send its sons into the graveyard. And in Washington, the CIA watched with both dread and anticipation. If the Soviets stepped directly into Afghanistan, the game would change forever. In the shadows, plans were being sketched, funds allocated, partners approached. A long war was about to begin, one where the soldiers in uniform would be pawns, but the real duel would be fought in the invisible realm of spies, lies, and betrayal. The night was coming when Soviet tanks would roll through Kabul, when Amin would fall, and when Afghanistan would become the center of the world's most dangerous secret war. But in the months before that night, the whispers were already there. Whispers of betrayal, whispers of holy war, whispers that Afghanistan's fate had already been sealed not in Kabul, but in Moscow and Langley. And in those whispers was the shadow of what was to come. And as the Soviets prepared their hand, as the CIA sharpened its knives, one question remained unanswered. Was Afghanistan about to become the Soviets' victory, or their Vietnam? The answer would only be written in blood. The silence before midnight was brittle, like glass stretched to its breaking point, and in Kabul it shattered in an instant. Soviet transport planes pierced the Afghan night sky with a low, menacing hum, their bellies full of men who had been told they were descending not upon a foreign battlefield, but into the heart of history itself. Below, the streets were hushed, dimly lit, heavy with the cold winter air. Yet, inside the Tajbeg Palace, Hafizullah Amin, the man who had clawed his way to power through blood and paranoia, paced the marble halls, restless, convinced that enemies were closing in. He had dismissed the whispered warnings that Moscow was plotting his removal. He believed his own cunning and the might of his palace guard would shield him. But even as he moved from room to room, the poison Moscow had ordered already seeped into his veins, administered hours earlier by a KGB operative posing as a trusted aide. The invasion had begun not with a tank, but with a sip from a crystal glass. On the outskirts of Kabul, convoys of Soviet armored personnel carriers idled in formation, their engines growling like predators in the dark. The men inside, Spetsnaz units, trained to eliminate with precision anyone Moscow declared an enemy, checked their rifles, adjusted their grenades, and tightened the straps of their helmets. They were told this was no ordinary deployment. Their target was not merely a battlefield, but a single man ensconced inside a palace he had turned into a fortress. The order was simple and chilling. remove Amin, secure Kabul, and ensure the flag of the Red Army was planted in Afghanistan before the West even knew what had happened. The first explosions cracked through the city just after midnight. Tracers streaked across the sky like fireflies of death as Spetsnaz stormed the palace gates. Afghan guards loyal to Amin fought back desperately, shouting in confusion, their gunfire echoing off stone walls. But against the precision and ruthlessness of Soviet special forces, their resistance collapsed within minutes. Rooms filled with smoke, blood pooled on the floors, and the marble staircases of the palace became rivers of fire and broken glass. Amin, coughing and disoriented from the poison that had dulled his senses, tried to command his men to fight, but his words faltered, slurred, almost drowned out by the roar of explosions outside. By the time Soviet commandos burst into his chambers, dragging him from the shadows, his fate was already sealed. Accounts differ on exactly how he died, whether he succumbed to the poison or was executed in the chaos, but the outcome was never in question. Hafizullah Amin, the self-proclaimed ruler of Afghanistan, lay lifeless in the same halls where only hours earlier he had plotted against ghosts of betrayal. His death marked the opening act of an invasion that Moscow insisted was temporary, necessary, and under control. But in reality, it was the point of no return. By dawn, the Soviet flag hung over key positions in Kabul. Tanks rolled through the city streets with deliberate weight, their treads grinding into asphalt as though to announce permanence. Columns of armored vehicles encircled the airport, the radio station, and government ministries. Loudspeakers declared that Amin had been executed for crimes against the people, and that a new leader, Babrak Karmal, flown in overnight under Moscow's watchful eye, was now in charge. Karmal appeared on Afghan state radio that morning, his voice trembling but obedient, as he promised stability, reform, and eternal friendship with the Soviet Union. The script had been written in Moscow long before the first shots were fired. But if Kabul was stunned, Washington was thunderstruck. In Langley, the CIA's nerve center flickered with urgency as reports trickled in from satellites, intercepts, and scattered human sources across the region. For months, whispers of Soviet troop movements had passed across analysts' desks, flagged with warnings that the Kremlin was edging closer to a full-scale invasion. Still, many believed Moscow would hesitate, unwilling to risk a quagmire in Afghanistan. Now, the denials evaporated in the harsh light of fact. The Russians had crossed the line. The Soviet Union had committed itself, openly and brazenly, to occupying a sovereign nation at the crossroads of Asia. Phones rang incessantly inside CIA headquarters. Analysts scribbled notes as satellite images confirmed armored divisions pouring through the Salang Pass. Military attachés in Islamabad and Tehran radioed that Afghan airspace was alive with Soviet transports ferrying reinforcements. One stunned officer muttered the words that rippled through the building like an electrical surge. "The bear is on the march." The White House was no less shaken. In the Situation Room, advisors huddled around maps and intelligence briefs, the gravity of the invasion weighing down every voice. President Carter, already battered by the Iran hostage crisis, now faced a second calamity, proof that détente was dead, that Moscow's ambitions had not been softened by treaties or summits, but sharpened by them. The Soviets had acted as if the United States no longer mattered in Afghanistan, as if the mountains themselves belonged to Moscow. For the CIA, the challenge was immediate and existential. Find a way to turn Afghanistan into a Soviet nightmare without plunging the world into direct war. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the mood was triumphal. Brezhnev's Politburo congratulated itself on a swift surgical operation. Amin had been eliminated, the Afghan capital was secure, and a loyal puppet leader was in place. Soviet generals briefed their superiors with confidence. The operation had been efficient, casualties minimal, the occupation stable. Their assessment was that within months, Afghanistan would be pacified, a reliable satellite state secured on the Soviet Union's southern flank. The operation was so clean, so decisive, that Brezhnev declared the intervention would be over before the West could even mount a coherent response. Yet, beyond the city, in villages scattered across snow-draped valleys, men whispered of vengeance. The news of Amin's death and the arrival of Soviet tanks was carried not by newspapers or radios, but by voices echoing in mosques, in bazaars, and in mountain paths. To the Soviet planners in Moscow, Afghanistan was a chessboard of strategic squares. To the Afghans, it was sacred soil, drenched in blood from centuries of resisting invaders. The whispers of holy war began almost immediately. A farmer in Kunar muttered it to his son. A mullah in Herat thundered it during Friday prayers. The word spread from ear to ear, a quiet fire that promised to burn hotter with each passing day. Jihad. Inside Kabul, Soviet soldiers patrolled with rifles at the ready, eyes scanning alleyways, suspicious of every face. They had expected flowers, gratitude, perhaps even relief that Amin's tyranny was over. Instead, they felt stares of cold hatred, silence thick enough to suffocate. The Afghans did not see liberators, they saw occupiers. And in the shadowed corridors of Langley, the CIA saw an opportunity. The agency began sketching the outlines of a plan, not yet fully formed, but fueled by urgency. If Afghanistan could be turned into Moscow's Vietnam, the Soviet Empire might bleed from within. Across the mountains in Pakistan, ISI officers were already in quiet discussions with their American counterparts, weighing the possibility of funneling weapons and money to the growing resistance. The Afghan people might not have chosen this war, but they were about to become its fiercest soldiers. The Soviets did not yet know it, but their midnight invasion had set into motion a war that would devour them from the inside out. What they believed was a surgical strike would soon unravel into a brutal, endless conflict. And even as Moscow celebrated its quick success, men in the CIA whispered in hushed tones of revenge, strategy, and covert war. It was here, in the frost-bitten December of 1979, that the stage was set for a confrontation not only between armies, but between shadows. The KGB would move to crush the insurgency before it spread. The CIA would plot to arm and unleash it. Afghanistan would become the board where the two greatest intelligence services on Earth played their deadliest game. And as Soviet tanks thundered deeper into Afghan soil and whispers of jihad rose in the mountain winds, the question was no longer whether Moscow could hold Afghanistan, but how long it could survive it. The game had only just begun, and the board was already soaked in blood. The whispers of holy war, faint and unformed in the valleys and mosques of Afghanistan, would soon become the thunder that reshaped the Cold War, and it began not in the mountains themselves, but in the quiet corridors of Washington, where a small group of men sat staring at a map, the red tide of Soviet tanks pressing south across the passes. And the question before them was not whether to respond, but how far they were willing to go. It was late winter of 1980, the snow still heavy on the Afghan highlands, when the CIA's most ambitious covert operation since Vietnam took root, not with an official declaration, but with a gamble whispered in the language of shadows: bleed the Soviets dry, no matter the cost. At Langley, the shock of the invasion had turned into something else, a grim determination that this was the battlefield fate had chosen for them. The Soviets had crossed the line, and in the White House, the Carter administration, so often accused of weakness, found itself staring at an opportunity dressed in disaster. Intelligence briefings were stark. Moscow believed Afghanistan would fold in months. The Kremlin's logic was simple: crush Amin's government, install a loyal replacement, secure Kabul with armor and Spetsnaz, and let the sheer weight of Soviet power do the rest. Yet, buried in the intercepts, in the human reports trickling out of Pakistan, were signs the Afghans would not submit so easily. Tribes once at each other's throats were now speaking of jihad. The mountains themselves seemed to conspire against occupation. It was here that the first outlines of Operation Cyclone began to take shape. The plan was simple in phrasing, but perilous in execution: funnel money, weapons, and training to the Afghan resistance, not directly, but through Pakistan's Inner Services Intelligence, the ISI, which would serve as both conduit and gatekeeper. The gamble was immense, to arm men they did not control, to fund factions whose loyalties shifted like desert winds, to unleash a force in the name of weakening the Soviet Union. This was not containment as the West had known it, but something far more reckless. And yet, the men at the CIA could not ignore the lure. Afghanistan could be the Soviets' Vietnam. In a secure conference room, an officer leaned over the table and spoke words that would echo for years. "If we can bleed them here," he said, "we may change the course of the Cold War itself." The logic was brutal, even cold. Afghanistan was not about saving a nation from occupation. It was about breaking the Soviet bear, one cut at a time, until it collapsed under the weight of its own wounds. Billions of dollars would eventually flow into the effort, but at the beginning it was little more than a handful of appropriations, shuffled quietly through budgets, masked as humanitarian aid. The men at Langley knew this was a lie they were writing into history, but in the game of espionage, truth was often the first casualty. Across the border in Pakistan, General Zia-ul-Haq sat in his uniform with his ever-calculating smile, fully aware of the leverage that had fallen into his hands. For the ISI, the flood of American money was not simply a means to fight Soviets, but a tool to shape the future of Afghanistan itself. From the very first shipment, choices were made not by the CIA, but by Pakistan, who favored Islamist factions over more moderate nationalists, seeing in them both loyalty to Islamabad and a bulwark against any Afghan independence that might later threaten Pakistani interests. It was a bargain Washington accepted with a nod, even as whispers of unease rose among analysts who knew the danger of creating zealots armed to the teeth. Weapons began to arrive under layers of deception. Old stockpiles from Egypt and China, bought with American dollars but marked with anything but American fingerprints, were crated and shipped into Karachi. From there, convoys carried them to secret depots, where ISI officers doled them out with a ruthlessness that favored their chosen allies. On the dusty airstrips of Pakistan's frontier, CIA officers watched planes offload crates of rifles, mortars, and eventually the prized anti-aircraft guns that would change the face of the war. Each shipment carried with it a mixture of pride and dread. They were empowering men they barely understood, men whose visions for Afghanistan were as conflicting as they were uncompromising. Among these men, names began to loom larger than others. Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Lion of Panjshir, whose disciplined fighters held the Soviets at bay in ambush after ambush, carving legends out of the valley that bore his name. To the CIA officers who met him, he was the ideal resistance leader, intelligent, principled, even charismatic, a man who fought not merely for Islam, but for an Afghanistan free of foreign masters. But Massoud was no fool, and he kept the Americans at arm's length, wary of their shifting agendas. Then there was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the ISI's favored son, a ruthless Islamist whose followers were as feared by Afghans as by Soviets, a man who saw rivals not as brothers in jihad, but as obstacles to be eliminated. Washington's officers found him chilling, but the ISI ensured he received the lion's share of weapons. To many in Langley, this was the first sign that their longest game was slipping out of their control. Money was laundered through shadowy channels, shuffled through banks in the Gulf, hidden in development grants and cultural exchanges. It was an elaborate theater of deception, each wire transfer masking the reality that America was now fueling a war it could never acknowledge publicly. Pilots flew covert airlifts of weapons under cover of night, their cargo manifests falsified, their flight plans doctored. Training camps rose in the Pakistani frontier, where young Afghans learned the art of ambush, sabotage, and explosives under the watchful eyes of both ISI instructors, and occasionally American advisors disguised as aid workers. The scale of the operation grew until it became the longest covert war in the CIA's history, a river of arms and cash that would run for nearly a decade. Inside the CIA, officers debated the morality of what they were unleashing. One veteran looked at the dossiers of the Mujahideen leaders and admitted privately that the men terrified him. They were inspiring, yes, in their willingness to bleed for their homeland, but they were also ruthless beyond measure, executing rivals, imposing harsh codes on villages, and dreaming not of democracy, but of an Islamic order that few in the West truly understood. And yet, to Langley, they were the only instruments sharp enough to carve wounds into the Soviet juggernaut. On the ground, the results soon spoke for themselves. Soviet convoys ambushed on mountain passes, helicopters struck by anti-aircraft fire, garrisons harassed until supplies ran thin. For every village burned by Soviet troops, a dozen more men joined the resistance. The CIA tracked the toll in reports written in bloodless language, but behind the numbers lay a brutal reality. Every rifle shipped, every dollar laundered, was buying both a chance at Soviet humiliation and the rise of warlords whose power grew unchecked. In Moscow, the war was beginning to drag. The quick victory promised had turned into a quagmire. Soviet generals requested more troops, more armor, more air support, but what they received instead were reports of ambushes multiplying like wildfire. The Kremlin could not see the invisible hand guiding the Mujahideen's growth, but they suspected, and suspicions hardened into certainty as weapons too modern, too precise, appeared in Afghan hands. The Cold War's most dangerous dance was now in full swing, fought not with armies in Europe, but in the shadows of Afghanistan, where every bullet carried the echo of superpower rivalry. For the CIA, the thrill of watching Soviet frustrations mount was tempered by the gnawing awareness that they were riding a tiger. They whispered about it in quiet offices, that when the war ended, the men they had armed might not simply vanish into the mountains, but turn their gaze outward. Yet, in the fever of the Cold War, those whispers were drowned by the louder call of strategy. This was America's chance to wound the Soviets deeply, to perhaps even tip the global balance. And so, Operation Cyclone continued, its river of money swelling, its networks expanding, its gamble deepening with each passing month. The CIA had committed itself to its longest game, a war of shadows and proxies, where victory was measured not in cities captured, but in the slow bleeding of an empire. And across the passes, in villages where children learned to chant jihad before they could write, the seeds of something far greater and far darker were already being sown, waiting for the day they would no longer need anyone's permission to bear fruit. They thought the tide was finally shifting, that the relentless flow of weapons and money through the shadows had begun to corner the Soviet bear. But history never allows only one side to play in silence, and just as the CIA's covert lifelines tightened around Afghanistan's mountains, another game began to unfold beneath the same desert stars. The KGB was watching, not from afar, not in vague intelligence briefings, but with a hand that reached into the same veins the Americans had carved open, a hand that could strangle as well as infiltrate. For every crate of rifles pushed across the border, for every stack of dollars slipped into the hands of warlords, the Soviets worked in the dark to make sure some never reached their intended destination. This was no longer a simple clash of armies. It had become a chess match played in blood and whispers, where betrayal was more valuable than bullets. In the chaos of refugee camps that sprawled like fragile cities across Pakistan's frontier, strangers arrived speaking perfect Pashto or Dari, claiming to be fellow escapees from burned villages. They prayed with the displaced, they carried stories of Soviet massacres, and they offered small gifts to build trust. Some of these men were genuine, but others were ghosts wearing borrowed names, KGB-trained infiltrators who had been slipped in with forged papers and carefully practiced accents. Their orders were precise: map the flow of supplies, identify recruiters, and most importantly, locate the men whose loyalty to the Americans was beginning to matter more than their loyalty to Afghanistan itself. Every meal shared around a campfire, every whispered promise of revenge, was a chance for Moscow to sink a hook deeper into the heart of the resistance. What the CIA believed to be an impenetrable pipeline began to sprout leaks. Somewhere between the warehouses in Karachi and the caves in Panjshir, weapons disappeared. Not all at once, not enough to raise alarms immediately, but in increments that gnawed at trust. A shipment of Stinger missiles expected by Massoud's fighters never arrived, replaced instead by crates that rattled with nothing more than sandbags. Cash that had been distributed through ISI handlers vanished into phantom accounts. At first, the Americans assumed corruption. It would hardly be the first time their so-called allies siphoned off the spoils. But slowly, fragments of information surfaced. A commander who seemed to know exactly when an ambush was planned, a Soviet patrol that arrived too quickly to be coincidence, a courier in Peshawar gunned down by men who left no trace but moved with military precision. The conclusion grew heavier with each incident. The KGB was not just reacting. It was inside the walls. Meanwhile, young Soviet soldiers, dragged into a war they barely understood, began writing letters home that smuggled the truth past censors. In cramped script on cheap paper, they described villages where they could not tell friend from enemy, where children carried rifles taller than their bodies, where an old man's smile could be the mask for an informer's gaze. Some wrote of comrades blown apart by mines hidden in dead animals on the roadside, of helicopters shot down by missiles that seemed to appear from thin air. They confessed fears their officers would never acknowledge, that they were not fighting an army, but drowning in a sea of ghosts. For them, Afghanistan was not a battlefield, but a trap, a place where death came from silence and where survival depended not on bravery, but on luck. The KGB read these letters too, and while censors tried to erase them from public view, the fear in those words reflected the very reason Moscow demanded retaliation at any cost. Within Peshawar, the CIA's lifeline city, where money, weapons, and men crisscrossed in a fever of covert war, a strange atmosphere began to take hold. Whispers circulated of informants vanishing, of recruitment drives collapsing when trusted leaders suddenly disappeared into the night. A tribal commander who had been scheduled to meet an American case officer simply never arrived. Weeks later, fragments of his body were found in a river. The message was clear, though no one dared to write it down. Someone was feeding the Soviets. Suspicion poisoned alliances. Commanders accused each other of betrayal, and the Americans, who had once believed their pipeline was invisible, now found themselves afraid to trust even the men they had armed. The KGB's special groups, elite units trained not for open battle but for infiltration, began conducting operations deep inside Afghan territory. Disguised as mujahideen, they raided villages, slaughtered families, and left behind evidence pointing to rival factions. The intent was not merely to kill, but to fracture, to sow distrust so deep that no leader could unite the fighters under a single banner. The Americans heard reports of these atrocities, but struggled to separate truth from deception. Every dead villager was another seed of hatred, and whether that hatred turned against Moscow or against fellow Afghans mattered little to the KGB, so long as unity remained impossible. Then, one night in Peshawar, the illusion of distance shattered completely. A CIA informant, long considered reliable, had just finished passing details about an upcoming supply run to his handler. Hours later, as he stepped into a narrow alley not far from the bazaar, he was shot twice in the chest by men who melted back into the darkness before anyone could even raise an alarm. His body was found slumped against the wall, his pockets turned out, but nothing of value taken. Panic rippled through the safe houses and guest houses where CIA officers lived under flimsy covers. If the Soviets could reach into Peshawar itself, if they could strike inside the very heart of the pipeline, then no one was untouchable. Quiet conversations turned to urgent arguments. Who had betrayed him, how much else was compromised, and whether the next body to fall would be one of their own. The realization spread like fire through dry grass. The KGB was not just watching from across the border. It was already here. The shot in Peshawar still echoed like a phantom, its ripples reaching mountain valleys and distant capitals, a reminder that the war had turned from smoke and dust to something sharper, colder, and more treacherous. In the same moment, the informant's body was found in that cramped safe house. The war in Afghanistan lurched forward into a new phase, one where shadows weighed more than armies, and betrayal could shift the balance of nations. The mountains, already steeped in blood and silence, became laboratories of deception, where men carried rifles in one hand and secrets in the other. It was here, in the jagged ridges of Kunar, Nangarhar, and Panjshir, that the spy war metastasized into something larger than even its architects had anticipated, with CIA agents slipping through the back alleys of Peshawar, ISI handlers manipulating both cash and conscience, and Afghan commanders playing a game so dangerous it consumed entire villages overnight. The Mujahideen, who once fought with desperation, now fought with a rhythm, ambushing Soviet convoys on winding mountain roads, planting explosives beneath supply trucks, and retreating like phantoms into caves. But what unsettled Moscow more than the hit-and-run attacks was the strange precision of these ambushes, the uncanny way guerrillas seemed to know exactly which routes to strike, which commanders to target, and which helicopters would land at which valley floor. It was a precision too fine to be guessed, a precision that whispered of American eyes in the sky, of CIA briefings passed through Pakistani intermediaries, of money flowing in such volume that even the mud walls of tribal compounds seemed to breathe it in. Yet, within this torrent of aid, fissures were already forming, as Afghan commanders, once bound by creed and cause, began to weigh not just faith against survival, but gold against blood. On certain nights, as Soviet artillery echoed against the cliffs, deals were being struck under lantern light. A commander who swore loyalty to the jihad by day would accept vodka and rubles from a KGB emissary at night. In one chilling case whispered in Langley's corridors, a Mujahideen leader tipped off Soviet forces about a rival faction's supply line, leading to an ambush where dozens of fighters were annihilated. And then, 2 weeks later, he received CIA weapons to replace what had been lost. Men who had grown up herding goats now found themselves navigating a labyrinth of double promises and lethal rewards, their loyalties auctioned to the highest bidder in a war where no one could afford to be purely honest and survive. For the CIA, whose officers worked behind carefully constructed covers in Islamabad and Peshawar, this duplicity was a nightmare in slow motion. Reports funneled back from the field were never fully trustworthy. A promise of loyalty was worth less than the paper it was written on, if it was written at all. Some officers confessed in private that they no longer knew whether the weapons they supplied were being used against Soviets or sold back to them in some twisted cycle. Even as Washington hailed each successful ambush as proof of progress, there were whispers that crates of rifles had been diverted, that ammunition had been deliberately shorted, that Afghan leaders who smiled for American cameras by day were, by night, drinking tea with Soviet intelligence in guarded compounds. The ISI, Pakistan's intelligence service, thrived in this ambiguity. They controlled the spigot of American aid, and with it, the fate of the resistance. Money and weapons entered Pakistan in vast flows, but once inside, they were redistributed not with impartial precision, but according to Pakistan's own calculus of influence. Certain factions received truckloads of rifles, while others were starved of ammunition until their loyalty could be reaffirmed. The Americans knew this, but tolerated it, calculating that alienating Pakistan risked losing the only corridor into Afghanistan. Yet, this tolerance came at a price, as entire regions of fighters found themselves beholden not to Washington, but to Islamabad, whose own interests often ran at cross-currents with the very strategy the CIA believed it was executing. As the war deepened, the Soviets began to adopt their own grim arithmetic. For every ambush on a convoy, a village would be burned in retaliation. For every helicopter downed, a market would be shelled. This logic of reprisal transformed the war from a contest of armies into a war against the Afghan people themselves. Civilians bore the cost of spy games conducted in safe houses and embassies, as Soviet commanders used terror to starve the Mujahideen of support. In the charred remains of villages, children wandered with blank eyes, and in refugee camps across the Pakistani border, women carried stories that bled with detail too harrowing to dismiss. And behind each atrocity was often a thread that led back to the intelligence war. A tip leaked, A map betrayed, a whispered word that turned suspicion into annihilation. For Soviet soldiers, many of them no older than the boys they were sent to fight, the war grew more unbearable with each letter home. Some wrote of the mountains as haunted places, where every shadow concealed a rifle barrel, and every peasant's smile might hide a dagger. Others spoke of comrades lost not in battles, but in sudden ambushes so precise they seemed orchestrated by someone inside their own command. These letters, intercepted in rare cases by Western intelligence, revealed not propaganda, but exhaustion, a sense of being swallowed by a war with no clear enemy and no end. Some soldiers admitted quietly that they no longer believed in the mission. They fought because there was no other option but desertion, and desertion meant death. The war was devouring their youth, one mountain skirmish at a time. Amid this grim stalemate, whispers began to circulate of a new weapon arriving in the hills. Not yet in great numbers, but enough to send tremors of fear through Soviet pilots. The rumors spoke of an American device capable of plucking helicopters from the sky as easily as a hunter might bring down a bird. The Stinger missile had not yet reshaped the war, but its shadow was already present in every flight, in every mission that required helicopters to hover over valleys where unseen hands might already be aligning their sights. Even before its wide deployment, the mere anticipation of such a weapon gnawed at Soviet nerves, feeding a paranoia that magnified the sense that they were fighting not just Afghans, but an invisible, calculating adversary with inexhaustible resources. Yet the greater danger lay not in the technology, but in the corruption of loyalty that had begun to rot the resistance from within. Afghan commanders, faced with the impossible task of sustaining their fighters through endless winters, began selling scraps of intelligence to whichever side would pay. Some tipped off the KGB about rival factions in exchange for cash, others accepted ISI bribes to shift allegiances, and a few even manipulated CIA officers into funding operations that never occurred, pocketing the money and disappearing into the mountains. Trust was not just fragile, it was a currency more volatile than ammunition, a commodity traded in whispers and promises that could collapse in an instant. The escalation of betrayal brought with it blood that could not be washed away. Villages thought to be loyal to the resistance were raided by Soviet special forces after tips provided by men who claimed to be their defenders. Civilians who had no part in the war were massacred in retaliatory operations triggered by intelligence deliberately planted by rival Mujahideen commanders seeking to weaken each other. Entire families were annihilated not because of ideology, but because of the calculations of men balancing power, survival, and ambition in the unforgiving landscape of Afghanistan's tribal war. In Peshawar, where the CIA maintained its fragile network of informants, the assassination of the agent had already set off waves of suspicion. And now, as reports of betrayals filtered back with increasing frequency, the mood turned from tense to paranoid. A whispered rumor began to circulate through safe houses and meetings. The KGB was no longer just across the border. They were here, in the very heart of the pipeline, listening, watching, and waiting. An American officer who had spent months cultivating a network confided in his journal that he no longer trusted anyone, not the Afghans, not the Pakistanis, and not even his colleagues. The walls seemed porous, the shadows seemed alive, and every success felt like bait for a larger trap. The war in the mountains had become something larger than itself, a crucible, where guns and money were only half the story. The true battle was for trust, for the fragile agreements that determined whether a convoy would reach its fighters or be ambushed along the way, whether a village would shelter resistance fighters or betray them to the Soviets. The CIA believed it was orchestrating a grand strategy, but in truth it was riding a beast it could barely control, a war where the lines between ally and enemy blurred so completely that sometimes even the fighters themselves no longer knew which side they were truly on. And it was in this chaos, as betrayals multiplied and blood flowed in valleys known only to locals, that a single phrase began to echo in whispers from Peshawar to Langley: "The KGB is inside the walls." The meaning was both literal and metaphorical, for whether by moles within the supply chain, informants planted in refugee camps, or commanders turning under pressure. The Soviet hand was no longer just across the border. It was here, reaching into the very heart of the covert war, tightening its grip with each passing month, ensuring that every weapon shipped, every dollar spent, every life risked, carried with it the possibility of being turned back upon those who had provided it. The mountains had long echoed with the sound of Soviet helicopters sweeping low over valleys, the dreaded gunships that had once seemed invincible, their rotors carving the air like scythes of death. For years, the Mujahideen had crouched in trenches or hid beneath rock faces, powerless to stop the Mi-24 Hind gunships that strafed villages and reduced entire ridgelines to rubble. But in 1986, something shifted, and it began not with explosions, but with whispers. Whispers that spoke of a weapon unlike anything the Afghans had ever been handed before. It was said to be light enough for a single fighter to carry, small enough to hide in a cave, and yet powerful enough to swat a Soviet gunship from the sky with a single shot. These whispers passed through bazaars, madrasas, and ISI safe houses, carried the weight of salvation. The Stinger missile had arrived, and with it came the promise that the skies themselves could be contested. The first time it was used, the Soviet pilot never saw it coming. The Mujahideen fighter, trembling with both fear and exhilaration, raised the launch tube to his shoulder, his mentor muttering hurried prayers behind him. The Soviet Hind swooped low, confident, its cannon tearing into the mountainside. Then came the plume of fire, a streak of heat-seeking vengeance, and seconds later the helicopter was a fireball tumbling out of the sky, its wreckage scattering across the valley floor. In that instant, everything changed. For the Soviets, who had ruled the skies with impunity, it was as if the earth had tilted beneath them. For the Mujahideen, who had spent years hiding like prey, it was the birth of a new kind of courage. The battlefield had been rewritten in smoke and flame. Inside Langley, the moment was marked with satisfaction, though few celebrated openly. The CIA had gambled by introducing the Stingers, knowing that once unleashed, these weapons could never be fully controlled. But the reports that filtered back, burning gunships, shaken Soviet morale, commanders warning their pilots to fly higher than was safe, were proof that the tide had turned. Reagan's America saw it as vindication, that technology and willpower combined could bleed the Soviet giant into retreat. Yet, in Moscow, panic crept into the halls of power. The KGB was ordered to prioritize the capture of a Stinger at any cost. Every fallen missile tube was treated like a treasure, and Soviet Spetsnaz units were dispatched into the mountains not merely to kill, but to retrieve, for the nightmare was not only military defeat, it was the possibility that the Americans would reverse engineer their own secret weapon from whatever pieces were salvaged. The race for the Stingers became a shadow war within the shadow war. Mujahideen commanders who had once dreamed only of freeing their villages now found themselves guarding launchers like holy relics, stashing them in caves and moving them under cover of darkness. CIA officers watching from across the border counted shipments and fretted over accountability. ISI handlers demanded loyalty pledges, warning their proxies that any man who dared sell a Stinger on the black market would not live long enough to enjoy the profits. Yet, money was always a stronger whisper than fear. In the bazaars of Peshawar, hints began to circulate. An unopened crate, a launcher untouched by battle, a weapon that might fetch millions if delivered into the right hands. For the first time, the CIA faced the terrifying possibility that their gamble might extend far beyond Afghanistan, that these very weapons might one day be turned against Western pilots in skies far from the Hindu Kush. Still, on the battlefield, the effect was undeniable. Soviet convoys that once moved confidently through mountain passes now halted until helicopters had scouted the route ahead. Pilots who had mocked the Mujahideen as bearded bandits with old rifles now flew with eyes darting nervously to the ridgelines, scanning for the glint of a launch tube. When a Stinger plume rose, seconds stretched into eternity, and many Soviet crews knew that no evasive maneuver would save them. The once mighty Hind, symbol of Soviet dominance, had become a flying coffin. But power never shifts without cost. Each missile fired was a decision shaped by intelligence games, by backroom bargains struck in Islamabad safe houses, by spreadsheets in Langley, and whispers in Afghan camps. There were betrayals, too, woven into the triumph. Some commanders hoarded the launchers, refusing to share them with rival factions, preferring to see fellow mujahideen bleed rather than empower their enemies within. Others quietly brokered deals with Soviet agents, feeding coordinates in exchange for money, playing both sides even as villages burned. KGB handlers, desperate, whispered promises to ambitious Afghan warlords, offering gold, weapons, or a seat at the table in a future Soviet-backed Kabul, if only they could deliver a stinger intact. Trust became a currency rarer than ammunition, and no man truly knew whether the fighter beside him was brother, rival, or spy. As the war escalated, civilians bore the weight of these secret struggles. In villages where a stinger had been fired, Soviet retaliation came swiftly, flattening homes, schools, and mosques with artillery and aerial bombardments. Families fled deeper into the mountains, their lives shredded by decisions made in Washington and Moscow, their children's futures shaped by the cold calculus of intelligence officers who would never meet them. The spy war had become a forge, melting humanity into raw strategy, each loss measured not in tears but in tactical reports. Yet the legend of the stinger grew faster than any fire could burn it away. Songs were sung of the weapon that brought down the iron birds. Stories spread of invincible mountains now crowned with flames of victory. For every helicopter that fell, new recruits poured into mujahideen camps, convinced they were part of a divine mission. The weapon was more than metal and circuitry. It was faith, forged into steel, hope with a trigger. But faith, like weapons, could be stolen, sold, or betrayed, and already whispers of missing launchers reached ears in Langley, where unease settled like a storm waiting to break. The Soviets scrambled for answers. They tried infrared flares, evasive maneuvers, even experimental armor plating, but the results were the same. Helicopters tumbling into ravines, pilots abandoning missions, commanders reporting crippling losses. For the first time since the invasion, the Kremlin had to consider that victory might be slipping beyond reach. Within the KGB, files marked urgent piled higher, intelligence officers promising their superiors that if given enough resources, they would seize a stinger and change the course of the war. And in the darkness of mountain caves, mujahideen leaders held their weapons tighter, knowing that the eyes of both superpowers now watched every trigger they pulled. The war in Afghanistan had entered a new phase, one where technology and betrayal, courage and greed collided in the thin mountain air. The Stinger missile had become both savior and curse, its trail of fire illuminating the battlefield while casting shadows that stretched across continents. And as Soviet helicopters fell from the sky and whispers of black market deals grew louder, one question hung unspoken in every mind touched by this war. Had the Americans unleashed a weapon that would not only bleed the Soviets, but haunt the world for decades to come? They said the bear could never fall, that the Red Army was invincible, that the revolution would outlast bullets and prayers alike. Yet, by the late 1980s, the very heart of the empire was cracking. And in Afghanistan, that fracture was no longer hidden behind official slogans, but spilling out in blood, silence, and retreat. Gorbachev himself had already broken with the mythology of eternal triumph when he whispered words that Soviet veterans never thought they would hear from Moscow. The war, he admitted, was a bleeding wound, not a glorious mission, but a festering scar draining the lifeblood of the Union. In those words lay the unthinkable, an acknowledgement that the Afghan mountains were not being conquered, they were consuming. Soldiers stationed in dusty outposts could feel the truth in their bones, the weariness in their skin, the invisible weight of years of ambushes and funerals. And in their letters home, they spoke less of victory and more of simply surviving long enough to see the AMU Darya again. Yet, even as exhaustion wrapped itself around the rank and file, the war did not end cleanly, because wars never end cleanly, especially when betrayal and abandonment hang in the air thicker than gunpowder. The Soviet machine still sent reinforcements, still issued orders to hunt mujahideen cells in villages that had already been burned twice over, but the soldiers carrying those orders no longer believed in them. Commanders knew it too, even if they would not admit it aloud, for morale does not collapse in a single moment, but in the slow erosion of faith, and faith had become the rarest commodity in the Afghan theater. Deserters slipped away into the dark, not to join the mujahideen, but simply to escape, because death seemed preferable to another winter in a war with no end. KGB officers stationed in Kabul filed reports filled with veiled desperation, noting how their networks of Afghan informants were evaporating, how communist officials who once swore loyalty to Moscow now whispered doubts in candlelit rooms, how factional rivalries inside the Afghan government cracked open into armed clashes that Moscow could no longer paper over with promises of solidarity. They wrote of generals bribing mujahideen commanders to keep certain supply routes open, of interpreters demanding safe passage guarantees in exchange for information, of entire districts that functioned only in name because the Soviet garrisons there were shadows of themselves. In Moscow, the Politburo fought among itself, but the truth could not be escaped. The Soviet Union could not afford to bleed like this forever. The economy buckled, factories rusted, lines for bread stretched longer than the military convoys rolling into Kabul. And mothers wrote letters not to the party, but to each other, asking when their sons would return, and why they had been sent to die in mountains that no one in Moscow had ever set foot in. Gorbachev's glasnost opened the doors just enough that whispers of discontent became public sighs, and suddenly the Afghan war was not a noble sacrifice, but a cancer gnawing at the empire's heart. He needed an exit, but every exit looked like defeat, and the KGB dreaded what defeat would mean not only for Afghanistan, but for the Soviet prestige across the globe. On the ground, the withdrawal began long before it was ever announced. Soldiers stopped patrolling beyond the wire at night. Convoys traveled faster and less cautiously, as though speed could substitute for strategy, and helicopters circled lower, avoiding mujahideen territory rather than confronting it. Afghan allies watched and felt the shift in silence because they knew what it meant. The men who had promised protection, who had handed them uniforms, who had asked them to translate, to spy, to risk their lives, were preparing to leave. In Kabul, government ministers tried to mask their fear with speeches, but even the applause in the parliament halls sounded brittle. Communist leaders turned on each other with ferocity, each faction believing that if they could outmaneuver the others, they might survive the day the Soviets abandoned them. For the CIA, the retreat was triumph, a vindication of years of covert arms shipments and training camps, but in the corridors of Langley, victory felt strangely hollow. Analysts already saw the outlines of something darker, something that did not look like peace. The Stinger missiles had given the Mujahideen wings, but they had also scattered seeds of chaos. Reports trickled in of black market deals, whispers of Stingers traded to actors who had no allegiance to the Afghan cause, only to the highest bidder. Officers scribbled in classified memos that while the bear was falling, what might rise in its place could be even harder to contain. Still, for the moment, Washington basked in the glow of triumph, declaring that the empire had been bled white, that freedom fighters had humbled a superpower, and that history itself had been bent to America's will. But history was not done with Afghanistan. As 1987 bled into 1988, Soviet units began their staged withdrawal, each convoy a symbol of retreat that no propaganda could disguise. The world watched through grainy television footage as Red Army columns snaked through mountain passes, soldiers staring out of truck beds with hollow eyes, knowing that they were leaving behind not only a battlefield, but people who had believed in them, fought beside them, and now faced certain death. The KGB sent frantic cables to Moscow describing the pleas of Afghan interpreters and collaborators who begged for evacuation, who knew that once the last helicopter lifted off the embassy roof, their names would be written on death lists. Moscow ignored most of them, calculating that saving thousands was impossible, that politics required sacrifice, that history would forget the faces of those left behind. Yet, history never forgets abandonment. It writes it in blood. When the last Soviet tanks rolled across the Amu Darya River, retreating into Uzbekistan, some soldiers kissed the ground of the motherland with tears in their eyes, grateful to be alive. Others carried shame heavier than their rifles, for they knew they were walking away from graves unmarked and promises broken. Afghan communists who stood on the riverbank felt the true meaning of betrayal in their bones, as the roar of departing helicopters became the soundtrack to their doom. Mujahideen fighters, once scattered bands of men clutching old rifles, now roared in victory, believing they had brought down the empire itself. And in a sense, they had. The bear had not only been wounded, it was collapsing, staggering back across its borders, its myth of invincibility shattered in front of the world. Yet, beneath the cheers, beneath the declarations of victory in Washington and Peshawar, shadows stretched long and dark. For the KGB, the war was not over. It was transforming. Their networks crumbled, but did not vanish. Their eyes remained even as their soldiers left, and their reports warned of something the CIA was unwilling to confront, that the men America had armed, trained, and celebrated as freedom fighters carried within them a fire that did not stop burning once the Red Army departed. That fire was already spreading beyond Afghanistan, already seeking new battlefields, already rewriting the script of global conflict. The collapse of the bear was not only a military retreat, it was the unraveling of a world order, the silent prelude to an age that neither Moscow nor Washington truly understood. The soldiers who crossed the Amu Darya thought they were walking away from the end of a nightmare, but they were stepping into the beginning of another, one that would haunt both empires in ways that none of them yet dared imagine. The war was over for Moscow, but for Washington the real consequences had just begun. The last Soviet column had rumbled across the Amu Darya. The Red Army saluted farewell to the mountains that had consumed nearly a decade of their empire's strength, and the Kremlin told its people the nightmare was behind them. Yet, in Afghanistan itself, the story did not end. It only mutated, darker and more uncontrollable than before. The bear had limped home, bleeding and exhausted, but the battlefield it left behind did not quiet. It roared in chaos. The very men who had once fought shoulder to shoulder against the Soviet invader now began to turn their guns inward, their alliances shattered by tribal rivalries, ideological fractures, and the cold calculation of who would inherit the ruins. The dream of liberation splintered into the nightmare of fratricide. For ordinary Afghans who had survived 9 years of superpower fire raining on their villages, the new war was in some ways worse, because it came from neighbors and former allies. Kabul, freed from Soviet tanks, soon became a city under siege, its neighborhoods carved into zones of control by competing Mujahideen commanders who cared more for power than for peace. The West, once jubilant at having humbled the Soviet Union through its Afghan proxy, suddenly found itself staring into a void it had helped create, a void where foreign fighters, radicalized ideologies, and ruthless warlords now circled like vultures around a carcass. In Washington there was celebration, but also unease. CIA officers who had spent years supplying weapons and money through Pakistan knew that the network they had built was not dismantling. It was metastasizing. The Stinger missiles they had smuggled in, the cash funneled through secret accounts, the training offered in remote camps, all of it remained, now in the hands of men whose loyalty had never been to America, but to their own visions of jihad and power. A senior officer would later recall, with an edge of regret, that victory had been too easy to declare, because what looked like the end of one war was the planting of seeds for another that no one wanted to see germinate. On the ground in Afghanistan, villagers who once prayed for deliverance from Soviet bombs now prayed simply to survive the shelling of rival Mujahideen groups. The warlord Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, once a favored recipient of CIA-supplied weapons through the ISI in Pakistan, turned his arsenal on fellow Afghans, raining rockets into Kabul in a ruthless bid for dominance. Other factions, fueled by foreign donations from the Gulf, carried banners of puritanical Islam, alien to many Afghan traditions, but now spreading with money, guns, and uncompromising zeal. In Moscow, the withdrawal was celebrated publicly as a necessary closure. But behind the walls of the KGB, bitter recriminations echoed. Networks painstakingly built over years collapsed as Afghan communist allies were hunted down or defected to rival factions. Afghan interpreters who had worked with Soviet units, teachers trained under Soviet programs, engineers who had built roads and dams, all became targets, branded as collaborators by the new warlords who smelled blood. For the KGB, this was more than the loss of influence. It was the unraveling of years of investment in ideology and human lives. Some officers reported with chilling detachment how entire families of interpreters were executed in reprisal, how Afghan officers who had studied at Moscow's military academies were shot by their own neighbors. The ghost of betrayal hung heavy in the valleys. For Afghans themselves, hope evaporated like smoke. One Kabul resident would later tell a journalist, "When the Russians left, we thought we had won, but soon the shells came from every side. There was no victory, only ruins." Streets once filled with celebration now echoed with artillery fire. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, but medicines were scarce. Schools that had reopened during the brief lull of Soviet withdrawal shut again as teachers fled the violence. A generation that had known only war now faced the grim prospect of adulthood in a country tearing itself apart, not under foreign occupation, but under the knives of its own liberators. In Pakistan, the ISI played its own dangerous game. Flush with Western praise for helping to topple the Soviets, its generals saw themselves as kingmakers in Kabul. They poured money and arms into favored factions not to stabilize Afghanistan, but to shape it into a client state under their influence. Refugee camps in Peshawar and beyond became fertile ground for new radical schools, where children learned not arithmetic or history, but the language of jihad, the promise of martyrdom, and the discipline of militancy. Many of these students would later become known to the world as the Taliban, but in the late 1980s they were simply the product of chaos, raised in exile, taught to fight before they could read, trained to obey clerics who offered certainty in a collapsing world. The Americans, distracted by triumph in the Cold War's larger theater, failed to grasp the danger. The Berlin Wall would soon crumble, the Soviet Union itself would implode, and policymakers in Washington congratulated themselves on a historic victory without pausing to reckon with the fire they had stoked in Afghanistan. As the CIA scaled back its direct involvement, the weapons and money already injected into the veins of the region continued to circulate, without oversight. Foreign fighters who had come from across the Arab world to wage jihad against the Soviets did not return quietly home. They stayed, or they regrouped elsewhere, carrying with them the skills of guerrilla warfare, the taste of victory against a superpower, and a burning belief that jihad could defeat even the strongest enemy. Among them was a wealthy Saudi exile named Osama bin Laden, who had built networks of men, money, and ideology that stretched far beyond Afghanistan's borders. The ghosts in the rubble were not just the memories of the dead. They were living men, hardened by war, armed with the tools of terror and untethered from state control. Afghanistan had become a crucible, forging not only the downfall of the Soviet Union, but also the rise of a new global threat. Villages lay in ruins, families shattered, but in the shadows of those ruins, meetings were held, alliances struck, and blueprints drawn for wars yet to come. What Moscow had left behind was not peace, and what Washington had celebrated as victory was, in truth, the opening of a new chapter in a darker conflict. The superpowers had come and gone, but Afghanistan remained, bleeding and unbowed, its soil now the graveyard not just of empires, but of illusions. And so the camera of history shifts from the retreating Soviet tanks to the smoldering ruins of Kabul, from the chants of victory to the cries of betrayal, and from the satisfaction of one war's end to the ominous silence before the next storm. The proxy war had ended, but the men it had armed, trained, and radicalized were still there, waiting, watching, preparing. The world did not yet know it, but in those ghostly figures moving through the rubble lay the seeds of a conflict that would soon redraw the map of global security and bring war not only to Afghanistan, but to distant cities across the world. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had collapsed the bear, but its ghosts were only beginning to rise. And yet, when the guns of the 1980s finally fell silent in Afghanistan, the echoes did not fade away. They drifted outward, carried across borders and oceans, shaping currents that the world is still navigating today. The Cold War had ended, but the conflict had seeded forces that neither Washington nor Moscow could fully control. What had begun as a regional struggle had opened doors to movements that were no longer bound by geography, fueled by veterans of the battlefield who carried their cause beyond the mountains where it had first taken root. Afghanistan itself stood shattered, a place where hope seemed buried beneath ruins. Yet its story did not end within its borders. Out of the rubble emerged a generation hardened by conflict, networks of fighters who no longer needed state sponsorship to act. They forged alliances in deserts, in hidden camps, and in forgotten corners of the globe, weaving together a fabric of clandestine power that transcended nations. These groups did not march under a single flag, yet they shared something more dangerous, a belief that they could reshape the world by force and a willingness to die in the process. For the intelligence agencies that had once treated Afghanistan as a proxy battleground, the war was supposed to be over. The CIA had chalked it up as a victory, the KGB had accepted it as a defeat, but both soon discovered that the legacy of their actions had created a new game without rules. Networks once nurtured in secrecy began acting on their own agendas. The fighters trained and armed in one conflict resurfaced in another, from the Middle East to Africa, from the Caucasus to Southeast Asia. The strategies that had once seemed like clever moves in a great power rivalry now looked like seeds of instability scattering across the world. Ordinary Afghans, meanwhile, bore the deepest scars. Families displaced in the 1980s struggled through decades of exile. Children grew up knowing only camps and ruins. Entire communities were left to pick up the pieces in a country fractured not just by foreign invasion, but by the civil war that followed when the foreign powers withdrew. For them, the so-called end of the war was merely the beginning of a new cycle of violence and uncertainty. As the decades passed, the names of new organizations emerged, their roots traceable back to those same rugged mountains and shadowy alliances of the 1980s. And in September of 2001, the world came to understand just how far those echoes could reach. A single morning of destruction and shock revealed that the story of Afghanistan was not confined to history books. It was a live wire running through the modern age. Today, the shadows of that era still linger. Intelligence agencies speak of networks that adapt faster than governments can respond, of ideologies that leap borders with a speed greater than armies, of digital battlegrounds where recruitment and radical ideas spread invisibly. The world we inhabit now, shaped by heightened airport security, endless surveillance debates, and global interventions, is inseparable from decisions made decades ago in the back rooms of Langley and Lubyanka, when a distant war was seen as a means to an end. And so, the story closes not with triumph, but with a warning. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the shadow war between the KGB and the CIA ended long ago, yet its consequences still unfold. The Cold War may have been won, but in its ruins new conflicts arose, conflicts less visible, more unpredictable, and harder to contain. The ghosts of that war still walk among us, not in uniform, but in fractured states, in shifting alliances, and in the enduring question of what happens when great powers use smaller nations as pawns. The rubble of Afghanistan was never just a graveyard of empires. It became the proving ground of the world we now live in. And as history has shown, once unleashed, shadows rarely return to silence.